Welcome to the IJSec Juniper Secure Connect demo. And here we have VSRX1, but before we get started, let's look at the topology to see what we're doing. Alright, so here is our topology. In the topology, we have VSRX1, which will be acting as our gateway. So we have that remote worker up top that will be using the Juniper Secure Connect application to connect into the gateway, which is VSRX1, to access internal resources. And so speaking of VSRX1, we have a few different interfaces and zones I want to talk about. We have the GIGI001 interface that has the 172.18.1.1 IP address, and that is a part of the untrust zone. Then we have the GIGI000 interface that has the 172.16.10.1 IP address that is a part of the servers zone. And then server 1 is in the servers zone with the IP address of 172.16.10.100. Now keep that IP address in mind. That'll be very important as we get into this demonstration. And then we have the GIGI002 interface, which uses the 192.168.1.1 IP address that is a part of the user zone. And in the user zone, we're going to have a bunch of different users that are part of that branch network. And there is a device, although it's not listed, that is using the 192.168.1.100 IP address. And so with that, we want the remote worker to be able to work remotely, and they need access to the server 1 device. And so we can provide that with Juniper Secure Connect. And one other thing, we want them not to be able to access devices in the user zone. There's no point in them accessing that. What they need to do is access server 1, which in our case will be a web server, and they'll need to be able to do that remotely. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and jump back to the JWeb of VSRX1 and get this going. All right, so here is the JWeb interface for VSRX1. Let's go ahead and log in. And the first thing we want to do is we want to create a certificate that we'll be able to use with Juniper Secure Connect. And we'll go to Certificate Management, Device Certificates, and we need to create a new device certificate. And the certificate type of locally self-sign is what we want to use. Now the certificate ID, we just need to give it a name. We'll call this JSC for Juniper Secure Connect. The encryption type of RSA encryption works great. And then the key size, we're going to change this to 2048 bits. The 1024 bits will work fine, but a little extra encryption doesn't hurt. And then with the subject, minimum, we need to specify one field. And as it says here in the title, so we're going to put Juniper as the domain component and not configure anything else there. And then the subject alt name, we need to specify the domain name. Now here we can specify a domain name. We're going to specify a domain name of jsc.edu. And we can also specify an IP4 address if necessary. And with this, something you'll see a bit later when we set up the Juniper Secure Connect application is that we have to use the domain name that we have here or the IP address in the URL field. So keep that in mind. If we specify an IP address here, we could use that. And that's typically going to be the IP address of the external facing interface, or we can specify the domain name that will resolve to the IP address of the external facing interface. So let's go ahead and click OK to generate this certificate. Take just a minute. Okay, so that certificate has been created, and we can click the detailed view button, and we can see here the different parameters that we set for that certificate. So if you need to go back to look at anything, say you forgot the domain name you were going to use, you can look at it here. And so let's go ahead and click OK to dismiss that window. And then we need to go to the basic settings to configure some system services. So let's select the system services option. And we need to configure the HTTPS parameters. Now we do have this enabled. If it's not enabled, you need to enable it. Interfaces here are set to all, or you can specify a specific interface. I'm just leaving it at the default of all. And then under the HTTPS certificate, we need to change this from default to PKI certificate. And then we need to select that certificate we just created. And then click Save up top. And then it gives us a prompt that we need to commit the configuration. And we'll do that later because we have to do a bunch of other configurations. So let's wait to commit things. So let's select the VPN workspace and then select Create VPN, Remote Access, and then Juniper Secure Connect. And here is the wizard for creating a remote access VPN using Juniper Secure Connect. The first thing we have to do is we need to name it. So we'll call this RA for Remote Access, JSC for Juniper Secure Connect VPN. And we can give it a description. Routing mode has to be set to Traffic Selector Auto Route Insertion. You can't change that. Authentication method, we can save pre-shared key. We're going to use a pre-shared key here, but we could use certificate-based as well. And then the auto create firewall policy parameter, that's default set to yes. We can change that to no. If you were to set this to no, you would have to manually create a firewall policy that would allow this traffic. I'm going to change this back to yes. It's great. It's a shortcut that will set up a policy that will specifically allow only this traffic. I highly recommend you do that because it works really well. And then the next thing we need to do, we need to configure the remote user and the local gateway. And you can see a diagram here of the remote user connects into the internet, and then which is then connected to the local gateway. So let's select remote user. And the default that we have here actually works really well. We use the default profile. You can disable that if you want. And then we have to specify a profile under the VPN, IPsec VPN global settings, but we don't need to do that here. And so the default profile works fine. And then connection mode set to manual or always. Manual works great. And then we have the Ssl VPN option. And what this does is if the IPsec ports, the default ports that IPsec uses, isn't available, then it will fall back to an Ssl VPN and use port 443. That port is usually open. And something else I do want to point out is these tooltips we have here. If you're unsure about any of these parameters, hover over the tooltip. It'll give you information on what this parameter does, and it's incredibly helpful if you're not sure. Then we can enable biometric authentication. We're not going to use that here, and also dead peer detection as well as the Windows logon feature. And so let's go ahead and click OK since these settings work good. You can see here now there's a green check mark over the remote user section, and the remote user is now highlighted in blue. That is the remote user section. So let's go ahead and click on local gateway to configure the local gateway. And here we specify an Ike ID. And so it's got to be a username in the format of an email. So we have lab@juniper.edu. And this is not something the end user will need to know, the remote worker that is. This is something that's just going to be part of the Ike ID, and the Juniper Secure Connect client will see that when it connects in to the gateway. And then the external interface. This is the interface that is pointing towards the internet. In our case, it's not Gigi000. That's the interface that points towards the servers. We need to change this to Gigi001. That is the interface that points towards the internet. And so that's the interface that the remote user will be connecting into. And then the tunnel interface. This is the secure tunnel or ST interface. We need to add one to this VPN. By default, it gives us the unit 0 for the interface unit. And you can change that to whatever you want. We can add a description, not necessary here. We need to select a zone. Now this is the zone, the security zone that the interface will be placed in. I have already created the VPN zone. Now if you haven't created a zone here for the interface, the secure tunnel interface that is, you'll need to go back and create one. And so keep that in mind. You can't create a new zone at this point. But you can just cancel this and then go to the section where you can create a new zone. And then we have to specify the routing instance. The default routing instance works great here, and that's the only one we have configured. And so let's click OK. And then we need to specify the pre-shared key. And so this pre-shared key is not something the user needs to know. This will be used with the Juniper Secure Connect client, that application. And so you need to put something here that is secure, but you don't want to hand this out to your users either. I'm just going to specify Juniper 123. And then it can be specified with ASCII or hex. So you have those two options. And then under user authentication, we need to add some user authentication. And then we have the access profile name. We'll call this JSC-access. And we need to specify some address assignment pools. There's nothing configured, so let's create a new pool. We need to name the pool. We'll call this JSC-pool. Specify a range for the pool. We're going to say 10.77.77.0. And also a net mask, or say /24. And then we need to specify at least a primary DNS server. And then we need to specify an address range. And so we'll call this JSC-range. Specify a lower limit. It's got to be in that range that we just specified. So 10.77.77. something, we're say .1. Then we're going to say 10.77.77.100. So we're going to hand out those IP addresses for the Juniper Secure Connect Remote Access VPN. Now, you might ask yourself, why would you want to do that? Why not just use the whole range? Well, you can for sure. But say you have something in that range, say 101, so 10.77.77.101 is, say, a server with a static IP address. You may not want to use that, so that's why you're given the option to specify a range. Now, if we wanted to use the whole range, we could say 10.77.77.1 to 10.77.77.254. That works fine too. And then we need to specify some local authentication. We specify a radius if we're using radius. Here we're just using local authentication. Now here is where you specify the user credentials. So this is the credentials that the remote worker would use. I'm just going to say our typical lab123. And then you could create additional users here to have different users log in using those different credentials. So let's go ahead and click OK. And then we need to specify an Ssl Vpn profile. So let's click Add. Let's call this Ssl Vpn-Pro, short for profile. We can turn on logging if we want. We don't need to do that here. And that would be logging on the local SRX device. This is not logging on the client, not the Juniper Secure Connect application. So that's completely different. Keep that in mind. Then we need to add an Ssl Termination Profile. And we need to name it. We'll call this Ssl-Term. And we need to select that certificate that we created earlier. Click OK. And click OK again. And we're almost there. The next option is source Nat Traffic. If that is enabled, which it is by default, then traffic coming in from the client, the remote worker, will be natted to a certain interface, source natted that is. And so we need to select the interface that belongs in the server zone. And that is Gigi 000, actually. It was actually set to that right interface. I selected the wrong one. And so basically it's going to be source natted to the 172.16.10.1 IP address. Now, why do you need that? Well, by doing this, recall that the address assignment pool is 10.77.77.0/24, something from that network range. And we specified a range within that of IPs that we wanted to hand out. And so when that comes in, the server's not going to know how to get back to that IP address. And so what it will do is that it will send the traffic using its default route, which will then not make it back to the remote worker. It won't go through the tunnel. And so what we can do here is we can change that IP as it comes in using source NAT, so the server will know how to get back to it, because it'll actually just send it to this IP address, and then reverse source NAT will put the traffic into the tunnel. And so if we deselect that, we don't enable that, we would have to set up some routing on the SRX device. Not that hard to do. It'd be routing saying the 10.77.77.0/24 network. It would be a static route that says send that traffic to the ST0 interface. Not a huge deal. But this allows you to avoid that extra configuration. It's a real simple way to get around that problem. Okay, so protected networks. What are the protected networks that we want to give access to, and which zone is that in? Of course, it's the servers zone. And by default, you're going to get the any address book entry, which is 000, all zeros. So basically everything goes in to the tunnel, and anything that is on the other side is accessible within that zone. Now, this would do what we want to do. By doing this, the remote worker would not have access to the user zone. And that's great. However, by doing this, by leaving it at all zeros, split tunneling is disabled. And we really don't want the remote worker to be watching YouTube at home while they're working. Maybe it's something related to work, who knows? But even then, that traffic with this configuration here would be going through the IPsec tunnel. We don't want that. And so what we can do here is we can add a specific address, and we're going to call this servers. We're going to add the address range for the servers, which is 172.16.10.0 and /24. So it gives you that entire range. And we could specify just server 1 if we wanted to. And then you get this pop-up here. Split tunnel is enabled when specific addresses other than any are selected. In this case, we're selecting the server's address object, and so split tunneling is enabled. So that means if that remote worker starts watching a YouTube video or something else, it's not going to go through the VPN. And that is a really good thing, especially with how popular remote work has become lately. And so we're only going to be sending traffic into the tunnel that is destined to this subnet, which is the server's subnet. So let's go ahead and click OK. And click OK again. And we've configured the remote access Juniper Secure Connect VPN. Now, one thing I do want to point out is we have a settings option here for IKE and IPsec settings. I can click that, and then you can change the default settings that you see here, as far as the encryption and authentication algorithms for IKE and IPsec, lifetime, Diffie-Hellman groups, dead period detection, and things like that. What we have here works really good, so there's no need to change that. There's really good security. So with that, I'm going to click Save to save this VPN, and then let's go ahead and commit the configuration. Right, so that commit is complete. So one thing to point out here is under IKE status, there's just a dash. That means that no one has connected to the remote access Juniper Secure Connect VPN yet. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump to the remote worker device and try the connection. Okay, so here is the remote worker device, and here is the Juniper Secure Connect application. And before we dive into that, let's go ahead and open a web browser and see if we can access that internal web server. And you can see here that juniper.net came up, so this user does have access to the internet. We know that much. And here's a bookmark for that web server, the internal address for it. So let's go ahead and click that. And as you can see, it seems to be just spinning. And if we were to wait long enough, it would just time out because it can't reach that internal resource using the internal IP address. So let's go ahead and minimize the web browser, and then let's connect with Juniper Secure Connect. And so in the gateway address, you just specify HTTPS, and then specify that domain that we put in that certificate. So that's going to be jsc.edu, and then click the connection button. And then we're prompted with the credentials, so we need to enter the credentials. lab123 for the credentials, and remember that was that username that we configured. And then we get the certificate warning. Now, why do you think we're getting this certificate warning? Well, the reason is because it's not a globally trusted certificate. This is just something we created. So you see this pop up showing it might be a threat. Well, we just know we created this, so we know it's not a threat, so we're okay to accept it. But before we do, so notice here in the DNS section that it shows jsc.edu. We need to connect in using that in the gateway address URL field that we see here. So keep that in mind. Now, if we configure an IP address when we set up that certificate, we could use that instead. But it needs to connect in on what is showing in on the certificate, or it will fail the connection. So let's click Accept, and it'll go through the connection process. You can see here how the different icons start changing. The tunnel is set up. Now we're authenticating the user, and the connection is established. That kind of goes away quickly, so let's go ahead and bring that back up. And so you can see here that the connection is established. Everything looks good. You can see the time online. You can see data transmitted in bytes or kilobytes. And you'll see that later. You see the speed, timeout, direction, the link type, as well as the encryption. And so if you wanted to look into the logs more, you can click Help, then Logbook, and it'll go through everything that happened during the connection process. Now, this is incredibly useful if you're having connection problems. So keep that in mind. That is there, that logbook. Now, this is the logbook that is locally on this device on the Juniper Secure Connect client. This is not logs on the SRX device. Recall that you could have configured logging, but we didn't configure that with that when we configured VSRX1. And so that would have been logging we would have configured on VSRX1. These are the logs that are on the Juniper Secure Connect client. And so things look good there. So let's go ahead and open up the browser again. And this should auto refresh, and yep, there it goes. So let's go ahead and reload it again, just to show, yep, it loaded up no problem. So we see the welcome to IJSEC Juniper Secure Connect website. And so this is the web server that we do have access to, and we didn't have access to it before we connected with Juniper Secure Connect. So we go back to the client itself, we can see a few different things. We can see data transmitted in kilobytes, 1.84 kilobytes. Data received in kilobytes, 1.76. So almost even, but that's just because it's just a basic web page I was loading. So not a lot there as far as asymmetric traffic going on. But you can see here we do have some traffic happening. And so one other thing I do want to pull up is I want to open a PowerShell command prompt. And so we can ping the server. We're going to get a ping running. And you can see here that, okay, great, we can ping the server. Now recall that I told you about a client in the user zone. That was 192.168.1.100, and we can't reach that. That's great. That's what we want. We don't want this remote worker to reach anything in the user's zone. And so I'm going to have that ping running for the client itself, and not the client, that is, I'm sorry, for the web server. And we're just going to leave that ping running there. And I'm going to open another PowerShell window. And I'm going to ping, say, ping juniper.net. And so I'm going to actually stop this other ping. We don't need that going. And so I'm going to just leave this ping running. And if we look at the client, actually, I'm going to start that other ping again. I want to show that there's traffic flowing through the tunnel. And stop this ping. And we can see here that this is incrementing. The data sent and received, that's incrementing. So let's go ahead and stop that. So that was a ping to the web server, the internal web server. And let's start this ping to juniper.net. That is something on the internet. Remember, we have split tunneling set up, so that traffic should not be going through the tunnel. And you can see here the data transmit and receive it is not incrementing. So we do have split tunneling enabled. If this worker went to YouTube and watched a video, then it wouldn't be going through the tunnel. So split tunneling is set up and everything is working as expected. So with that, let's go ahead and jump back to the JWeb interface and have a look at a few things. Okay, here is the JWeb interface. If we go away from this workspace, then come back, you can see the IKE status is shown as up. That's perfect. That's what we want to see. And then we can go to Monitor. And here in Monitor, we can go to Statistics, VPN Phase 1. We can see that we have the remote worker, that is the Juniper Secure Connect client, with an IKE session, a Phase 1 session. That looks good. We can go to Phase 2, and we can see the statistics, the encrypted, decrypted bytes, packets, as well, and also the security associations for Phase 2. So you can see here that Juniper Secure Connect is up and working, and traffic is flowing through the tunnel that should be flowing through the tunnel, and traffic that shouldn't be flowing through the tunnel is not. And so that does bring us to the end of this demo. So as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.